continuing on with our exposition in the book of Genesis, we have happened to get through the first 5 verses. We're now picking up with Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, which brings us to day 2. But before we do anything, I want to wake these all up, and I want to review something. This is a good teaching principle. Tell me the outline of the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis quickly. The inspired outline. Talking about.
The one you want.
Yes.
1 to 2. There's 2 parts in that, isn't there? One is the fact and formation, and next one is the filling afterwards.
Right. Fact and formation of original creation. Right? And then that original creation. That original creation is not recreated, but it is formulated and developed and filled. Right? From chapter 1, verse what?
3
to 25. Now, that whole section is subdivided into 2 major divisions. That formulating and filling of creation passage is naturally divided in 2. What is the first one? A general and chronological account of creation, which goes through what are the verses? 1, 3, 2. 2, 3 or 4? 2, 3? 2, 4.
2, 3.
2, 3.
1, 3 to 2, 3, and then 2, 4 to
25.
Yes. What is the second division? If the first one is general and chronological, what is the second account?
More specific and involved.
Specific and not necessarily chronological, although I believe it is. But it's not really.
Don't do that.
Okay.
It's June good.
We
could spend the rest of the class on
Just
this
leave
one.
it what I have in my notes.
Very good. Let's leave it. It is chronological in the first one and not chronological in the second one. But more specific. Okay, now that we are all there, we have covered the first day of creation. The first day of creation actually includes the creation of the original elements of everything and the first step in formulating and filling it. Actually formulating, there's nothing filling yet. Understand? The second part of the first day, he did what? Separated light from darkness. Alright? And as Morris says, this was basically the instituting of the, what is it? Electromagnetic and nuclear forces in the universe. Electromagnetic and nuclear forces in the universe, the creation of energy. Nuclear has to do with matter, the essence of matter, that energy is created right in the essence of matter, E equals mc squared. And electromagnetic is the laws that govern light and energy, all forms of light energy. Electro, that is the relationship between electrons, neutrons, photons, and all the other ons that we have in that universe. Well, yeah, he did. He separated them.
Allows different elements.
You're right. All different elements have different valences. You know, electromagnetic configurations, yes. So you can't really separate matter from energy. Energy is inherently, so that's nuclear forces, and then the electromagnetic forces are, I'm not a scientist, but
electromagnetic force, that's what makes some electrons want to go from the other one, form a molecule.
So the two have to go together, nuclear and electromagnetic. Fusion. Almost as bad as we already have. All right, so day 2 now, the record of day 2 is contained in verses 6 to 8. These verses record the divine design of, formation of, and identification of what Morris calls the hydrosphere and atmosphere. Hydrosphere and atmosphere. You ought to put that down. Verses 6 to 8. And God said, let there be a firmament. That is the word that is used with great significance all the way through these verses. A firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament. In the first verse he said it, and then the next verse he made it, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. So he brought it into being, and in the next verse, he identifies it. He names it. And God called the firmament heaven. The evening and the morning of the second day. Stage 1, planning stage. Stage 2, doing stage. Stage 3, naming stage. Follow? Mm-hmm. And that's all the way through. The planning, doing, and the naming. Or the designing, forming, and identifying. Morris calls the firmament the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. What is our atmosphere? Tell me what our... Pardon?
Usually ours.
Oh, okay, Earth's atmosphere is unique in that it has oxygen in it, but that's not what the atmosphere is.
Oh, that's the space between here. And then when things start to burn up in space.
Okay, what causes them to burn up? What produces shooting stars? What we call shooting stars. Friction is caused by?
Two things are moving against each other because one atmosphere moving against another.
No, it's not an atmosphere. It's an object coming into contact with a more dense, a higher density of molecules. In space, there's very low density. Around the Earth, there is a high density of molecules. Those molecules are made up of hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and I don't know how many other elements. Carbon. Right. That very small percentage of ozone, that sort of thing. Understand? So the atmosphere to us is that fairly dense gaseous band around the Earth. That's a very unscientific way of defining that.
Well, I understand that. I can't remember all those stuff.
Now this, unfortunately, Allison, my definition of the atmosphere is not what is actually happening on day 2. Let's put that, this present atmosphere is something like this.
3 atmospheres, I think. Right in this passage.
Yeah, there seems to be at least 2, anyway. Let's go through it. The word firmament in the Hebrew refers to an expanse, something spread out. It's a layer of something that separates other things. Okay? That's what a firmament is. It's an expanse. Something spread out. A layer which separates. So by its very definition, it's like a diaphragm. You know, your diaphragm separates your rib, your lungs from your stomach cavity, right? It's something that separates. It's a layer. now you begin to get a conception of what actually happened on day 2. One of the key elements here that is many times referred to, three times in verse 6 it refers to waters. 2 times in verse 7 he refers to waters. So 5 times in the day 2 account he refers to waters. Tell me, in what state were the waters on day 1? Without form and void. Totally wobbly, blobby.
I think it's something mass, it goes there once, it's still containing itself.
Right? Just totally intermingled. There was no definition to it at all. Okay? It was intermingled with matter. And so on the first day, he separated the laws that had to do with matter and energy. Okay? And then on the next day, with that other part of his creation he hadn't done anything with, which is the waters, then he defined them. On day 1, they were without form and void. And so on day 2, he separates waters from waters. And the thing that separated them was a firmament. So he had to create the firmament, or form the firmament, out of whatever existed. Right? So the design that we read of was to create an expanse that would separate between 2 layers, an upper layer and a lower layer. In verse 7, we have the actual formation of these components. When it says God made, we have the Hebrew verb asa, which means to labor or to work about something, to produce. And so what God did was he produced, he formed through this process from already existing materials, water and air. He formed an upper water collection, which has been called a canopy, and which has no parallel with our present atmospheric design. Called a canopy. It's not, the word canopy isn't there, but that's a word that biblical commentators use to describe this upper waters. Right? So if we were to diagram what we are seeing this is the firmament. He creates a firmament that separated water below from water above. If this represents the basic sphere which hasn't been formulated yet, all right? If nothing has been defined down here, but it is evidently there. Waters above from waters below. This separation was created or formed on day 2. This part is called the canopy.
Is that literal water?
Sure.
Like water?
We used to do it to water, and then we could do water. It's like water on water.
Okay,
That's just like that.
Right, you don't necessarily have to draw the earth in here. Okay, waters below from waters above. Okay, he separates. Okay, so this is the water canopy around the outside of the world.
Did you have that?
No, that's right.
I've heard sanitation. I just use it.
Yes, because at one time it's very evident that back at somewhere near the origins of this planet, it seems as if a universal tropical atmosphere existed. And Morris, along with other people, suggest that this was due to this upper water canopy. Right? You can just imagine. It'd be like living in a house with water all around. If you had water running off all the walls, what would it be like inside your house? Very damp, right? Damp and very different than it is at present. Right? So in Morris's view, this is a tropical type atmosphere around the sphere. The waters below the firmament, as we see later, were as yet still unbounded. They were still intermingled with earth. So there's nothing formed yet. Okay? A couple of references to this. Job 38, verses 8 and 9. Remember that passage where God is speaking to Job? He says, hey, you. Where were you when all this happened? When the morning stars, verse 7, sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud its garment and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and broke up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shalt thou come, but no farther, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Now, I've read verse 10, which alludes to day 3, right? But verse 8 and 9 refers to the cloud, its garment, and thick darkness, a swaddling band. Understand? So Job alludes to this band of cloud around the world, around the earth. Psalm 33, verses 6 and 7. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathereth the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up the depth in storehouses. Verse 6 refers to the heavenly waters, and verse 7 refers to the earthly waters. What was that? 33, 6, and 7. And there's also an allusion in 2 Peter 3, 5 to this. For this skeptics in the last days are willing to ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. The second part of verse 5 refers to day 3. The first part of verse 5 refers to the heavens were of old by the word of God. See that? God said, let the heavens be the way they are. By the way, and I didn't have this down here, but later on when we have the flood account given to us in chapter 6 to 8 in this book, what happened to create the flood? Like how was the canopy of heaven, it says, was open. It actually uses the word canopy in Genesis chapter 6. And not 6, I think it's chapter 7. And it says the waters of the upper canopy were destroyed. And they were released upon the earth, and that is how come the whole earth was completely flooded, and the foundations of the earth were destroyed too. Things that God had set in motion day 2 and day 3, separating the upper waters from the lower waters, and then day 3, when he comes along and separates land from water on the sphere, there was a great cataclysm. He just said, okay, enough of this. How? He destroyed the canopy, and he destroyed the original earth-water boundaries. And that's what created the flood. It went to where it now is. It hasn't changed since.
But it went to where it is now, and you had a flood out of it. How come we don't have a flood now?
An original earth boundary?
Exactly, that's what it was.
No, it says in the word the waters went into the earth. No reason God can't do that.
I've heard that the planets are supposed to be floating. Not the planets, the continents are supposed to be floating. So there's water obviously down there.
There's no thing out of there. But see what I'm saying? I realize the clouds are about to break down the ocean.
Very good.
Change the geography of the land.
So the pre-flood, or what is known as the pre-diluvian world, is very, very different. In fact, in chapter 2 and verse 5, it says, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Prior to the flood, there was no such thing as atmospheric rain. So this water canopy, whatever it was, had a very different relationship to the planet. Although the planet actually had been formed then.
Wow, they never knew that.
That's why it's kind of funny. Oh, build me an ark. Why? It's going to rain. What?
What's rain?
It's going to Google.
So Noah goes around. It's going to rain, everybody. Oh, wait, no. What's that?
So it had never rained.
No wonder he was an idiot. I mean, he sounded like an idiot. Let's go laugh. Oh, crazy no. He said he's going to what?
Build them an ark.
Christ is going to come out of heaven? What? You haven't seen that before. As it was in the days of Noah, Jesus said, so shall it be in the days of the coming Son of Man. People are going to eat, they're going to be merry, and they're going to laugh at the message because it makes sense. I've never seen anybody descend out of heaven in clouds, visiting the whole earth is going to see. With a great cloud, with an army, go off it. You don't do that kind of thing, do you?
I do, I'm here.
Okay, so the identification in verse 8 given to this expanse, which by its very existence formed Africanity, was the word heaven. God said, let this place be, this is heaven. So obviously, he's specifying something and calls it heaven, even though he used the same word for space in the beginning of day 1 to describe the original creation. Okay? So now he has redefined what heaven is. Okay? Oh, lots of time. Let's do day 3. Verses 9 to 13. Once again, we have a record of divine design. Step 1. Step 2, divine formation. Step 3, divine identification.
Will you do that over now?
This is happening every day.
Yeah, but
Okay, design. Don't get mad at me. I'm simply saying you should get used to this because it happens on every day. First he designs it, then he makes it.
I already said this.
Yeah, and then he identifies it.
Used it in words.
We did. Well, plan doing.
Plan, made, and named.
You just confused me with the question.
What is it, verses? 9 to 13. So we have 2 more aspects of creation here. This time it concerns dry land and plant life. Verses 9 to 10 concern the dry land, and verses 11 and 12 concern plant life. Well,
In one day, it takes a year to do that.
in both of these instances, the design is once again according to the counsel of the Word. It says in both cases, and God said. We read that in verse 9. And God said, let the waters of the heaven be gathered together, etc. And then in verse 11, when he talks about the vegetation, he says, and God said, let this happen. So it's divine design. Right? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3. By faith we understand that the world was framed by the rhema of God. That is the spoken word. Not the revealed word, but the spoken word. Okay? The formation of dry land is according to the redistribution of the already existing waters into newly ordained boundaries. Up until this point, water and earth under the firmament had been thoroughly intermingled. As Morris puts it, in a sort of watery matrix. It's like a mud puddle, right? Water and dirt all mixed together. Okay? That's what it probably was, something like that. Okay? Now, on day 3, God set definite boundaries. We've already read Job 38, verses 4 to 11. Especially verses 10 and 11 to this point. Here are a couple of other references. In fact, there are quite a few to this one. Job 26:10. 26:10. Well, why not give them to you, and then you read them. I'll give you all the references first. Job 26:10. Psalm 95, verses 3 to 5. Psalm 93, verse 4. Psalm 33, verses 7 and 9. Psalm 104, verses 5 to 9. Proverbs 8:29. Jeremiah 5:22. See the Proverbs 8:29. 5:22. Okay, Steve, you want to read the Job 26 reference? Blair, Psalm 95. Allison, Psalm 93. Brian, Psalm 33. I'll read Psalm 104. Which one? 93, I think I gave to you.
Yeah. 3.
When you have it, start reading.
He has compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night change come to an end.
I won't make any comment.
Anybody? 325? Yeah.
3:25.
For the Lord is great. The Lord is a great God, and the kingdom of all. His hand is a deep place of the earth. Strength for the hill and the valley. The sea is his and the name, and his name is great.
The Lord lifted up the Lord, the Lord lifted the Lord on high, and his anointing and energy and the mighty moves. Like testimony are very sure things become
He gathered the waters of the sea together in the deep. He laid up the depths and storehouse. And said, all the earth fear the Lord, for all the inhabitants of the Lord stand in awe of him.
Pile the water up. We stack the ground over here. You set the bound. Can't go any farther than that.
And verse 9. Oh, I should have sung that.
For he spake and it was done. He managed to serve that.
No, he said, well, the water can't go any farther.
Oh.
Okay? Psalm 104, verses 5 to 9. Who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever? Thou coveredst it with the deep, as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled, that is the waters. At the voice of thy thunder they hastened away. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys unto the place which you have founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth.
That must have been
That's
after the flood.
yeah, sort of. That's probably a better reference to the flood rather than creation. Okay, anyway, we won't read the other ones, but there are many references. This particular act on day 3 by God in distinguishing water and putting it over here, and the land masses over here, is used frequently in the Old Testament as a demonstration of the sovereign power of God. Obviously. Have you ever tried to make a lake?
Somewhere in that book.
Right.
That verse 9, that we just read, that can be treated because he took the waters off. Didn't want to cover it.
Except that he says that they turn not again to cover the earth. It could be referring to creation, sure.
Because it didn't immediately, he didn't turn it back and all flood back in. I know the factor
want another big term? Morris calls this the formation of the lithosphere. Lithosphere. What is the Greek word lithos? Stone. So he basically created stone, rocks. Yeah, rocks and separated from water. The lithosphere. Yeah. Now the next step, after verse 9, after making it and identifying, I'll read it. God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place. All the waters go over here, let the dry land appear. And it came to pass. God called the dry land earth. So he renames more specifically what earth means. And the gathering together of the waters, he renames them seas. And God saw that it was good. And God, now, verses 11 and 12 give us the creation of the biosphere, or the formation of the biosphere. And God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation. Isn't that interesting? It's all like evolution. Everything came from a little blob, including life. Isn't it? It's kind of disturbing. It disturbed me the first time I realized that. But life, plant life, came from dirt, from the elements. And when plants die, what do they return to? The elements.
Even any of these false ideas have to have a little bit of truth in their own. Take the certain anywhere. Guiding what's going on.
They can't have creation ex nihilo. There's only one other alternative. It has to come from what was.
That's not that God was so well.
Makes matter eternal.
Why not?
If you could believe that. When God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. Now notice carefully. This is really a neat picture. And the earth brought forth grass. Now, if I remember right, the Hebrew word for grass is for green sprouts, new green sprouts. So all of a sudden, poof, it looks like grass all over the earth, right? First sprouts. And herb yielding seed after its kind. And the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after its kind. So as these things continued to mature, one stayed grass, and the other kept growing into raspberry bushes, and the other ones grew into palm trees. And with the passage of time, they matured and produced fruit. And then from then on, it was self-propagation. That's the idea. Let this planet, the elements, bring forth these things. So this is the creation of the biosphere, all flora and fauna.
Oh yeah.
And there weren't any weeds.
Grass is a weed.
Well, maybe today is twitch.
Well, how can you say that? There's no weeds. Because weeds were brought in after.
The Hebrews have different words for new sprouts. In Hebrew, there are different words for new sprouts and matured plants gone to seed. And they don't use that mature word, they use the other one, first sprouts, tender, as opposed to grass gone to seed. So the earth brought forth what was already existing in the soil. This was a reorganization of already existing matter, which had been created from nothing on the first day. The Hebrew rendering makes the actual process clearer to visualize. The earth put forth first sprouts of herbs, producing seed after their kind, and trees producing fruit which had their seed in them after their kind. Thus the entire earth is now covered with grass, or first sprouts of all the various species of plants, herbs, and fruit trees. And each sprout, by divine design, had within itself a unique genetic structure which would then, when mature, reproduce itself.
Curious. Sure, but God placed them in the garden. To care of them. Then he takes them out of the garden. Then they're in weeds and stuff. be a false statement to say that weeks weren't created at this time. I just want to be specific. Is there a...
No, because he specifically mentions thistles and stuff like that as part of the divine judgment because of sin. It didn't enter until after the sin event. It was specifically stated as part of the judgment.
But this one was created with them, doesn't it? See what I'm
He
saying?
didn't create it, he mutated it at that point. I'm sure that whatever already existed, he simply said, El Twisto. And so instead of rhubarb, you've got burdock. See, it looks exactly the same. Right. Instead of raspberry bushes, you got poison ivy. You know, you just slightly changed the genetic structure of it. No, I'm not being dogmatic, but I don't think that he created weeds. Yeah, it would make sense. Read it, Genesis chapter 3.
I read it. Something's a little bit less specific than others. This is one of them.
Didn't create death. All with those trees live forever. That's no sense in it. That's a good stop. God created it, there was no death. No, it was meant to stay. But the fruit had to reproduce its own.
That principle came as a natural, it was naturally implemented. God had already, prior to the fall, said, this is my law, and it will come into operation if and when you sin. If you disobey it, dying you will die. And so if they had never eaten, the law would have never been implemented. And so we can assume, extrapolating backwards, that no, there would have been no death, and that all the original creation would still be here today.
Except that seed in the plant has to die to produce fruit. Has to enter the ground.
Or just they would produce fruit and then we just ate it. Unless you picked it and ate it and then another one.
Every time you took a bite, it was making a difference. So you could go along, you don't have to pick it, you just take a bite.
You cut a steak off a cow.
Oh man, we've got some wild speculative theology here. Let me give you a couple of references for this filling and formation on day 3. Job 38:27. Job 38:27. God asks in verse 22, have you entered into the treasuries of the snow, or have you seen the treasuries of the hail, which I have reserved against time of trouble? Who has divided the water course, verse 25? Who caused it to rain in the earth, verse 26, where no man is, on the wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and the waste ground, to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? Who has caused the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? As allusion back to the creative week. That's 38:27. Also, Job 40, verse 20. Surely the mountains bring him forth food where all the beasts of the field play, referring to God and his creatures. The mountains bring forth food, a reference to plant life coming from the soil originally. Psalm 104, verse 14. 14. God causes the grass to grow for the cattle and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. So, for the first 2 times now, in the creative week, in verses 9 and 13, on this day, only on day 3 did God say it was good. Well, I think the inference is that God thinks life, the life principle, is good. See? And up until this point, no living matter had existed. There had been matter, but no life. Flora and fauna were brought into existence. Oh, that's very shot. Because he saw the seeds and the earth and said it was good.
What were you trying to say?
I was trying to say that the reason that it first says that God saw that it was good is because it was the life principle that had been formulated.
So it's not the only day though.
Oh no.
The only day is the first of the last
The
one.
first day you're saying.
The statement God saw that it was good, it only occurs for the first time on day 3, after he separated water and rocks. Perhaps we could speculate that God realized that now it was possible for life to exist, and that was good in his view. Up to this point, it wasn't possible for plant life, human life, and animal life to exist. Now it's ready, so it's a good thing. I don't know. That would be speculation. But on every subsequent day, yes, he did say that it was good. But on day 1 and 2, he didn't. It's not that it wasn't good, it's just that there hasn't been a reason for that yet. All right. We will go fast in this when we get to other parts of the book of Genesis, but we are so ignorant of what the creative week is about that it's fascinating studying. Once again, I guess the only practical thing you can derive from this is to realize that God is sovereign, and that science is not necessarily in conflict with revelation. It makes sense. By what normal, continuing law of science can you explain fossilized coral beds 200 or 300 feet above sea level in the Arctic tundra today?
At a Christmas event.
The only thing that you can draw from that is that at one time the atmosphere existed even in the tundra that was tropic in nature.
That makes sense because you don't have it at this point. The sun and the moon having their polar capacity in 100 years. If you can't be over it.
Even if they existed, it probably would act differently.
Because you think of the tropics, the mass densities they have above them, you can't see heat. And if you can't, it manufactures this. And you have no heat loss, and it's good vegetation in the system. Worldwide.
The best explanation for the great dinosaurs and stuff, according to Morris, he says, it was such lush vegetation, there's overabundance of food. These reptiles had no, or very few natural, there's reference to them, killed 38, 39, 40.
What does he call that one?
Behemoth and Leviathan.
Got a movie out about that now.
Cygnus?
Scary stuff.
Maybe we should go to the theater.
They got a few of them up there, pretty deep sea things.
It's funny now that people are saying greenhouse effect. It's a little late.
The only cancer we got left is one.
That are pretty well healed. Those are considered to be in executive positions, places of leadership in the factories and society and the professions. They're the ones that seem to be in place of leadership. Now that accusation isn't true for all people who do have means and who are in places of leadership in the world. Because I've met some very, very godly people who are men of means.